Hello and welcome to the RIBA. It's very nice to see the room full and the building getting fuller. My name is Simon Alford. I'm an architect and I'm currently passing through this institute as president. Thank you all for joining us for the first talk in our RIBA VitrA summer season of talks. This is, as titled, A Life in Architecture, Nigel Coates. This talk is part of our ongoing partnership with VitrA Bathrooms. It's been running for a number of years. It's a very important partnership. It opens up the institute and brings different audiences and different discussion, and that's really vital, that discourse. So I'd very much like to thank VitrA Bathrooms for sponsoring this series of talks, of which this is the first. This evening's lecture coincides with the launch of the book Lives in Architecture, Nigel Coates, which was published by RIBA Publishing earlier this month. The book features over 120 images. This is the promotion. The book features over 120 images of Nigel's most celebrated projects. As he just said now, people think he hasn't built a lot. He's built a great deal. And it's a really great read, which often isn't the case with books about architecture. And it's about the life of an architect. And as Nigel will tell you, he is not an architect by title, because I think like many people at the AA, he never did his history diploma or whatever it was and never got his part 3. And we had this conversation recently, and that is a problem for the Institute, not for Nigel, because he is every inch an architect in the broader sense of what an architect is, someone who thinks about the environment in which they live, whether that's to design buildings, objects, movements. He's steeped in architectural culture. I'm pleased to announce that following the talk, copies of the books will be available for you to purchase in the foyer, and I'm sure you can get Nigel to put his imprimatur on them. But back to tonight's talk. Nigel has a CV that's written here, which I'm going to skip over, because I think his Lives in Architecture will talk about that, because it's interwoven, so I'm going to skip over a number of things. But what is important is he will be joined at the end in conversation by Ivona Blaswick, Curator Emeritus of the Whitechapel Gallery. So yeah, I think that will be an important part of the evening, and there'll be opportunity for you to ask questions. So I've skipped over the formal CV, and I'll talk a little bit about Nigel as I know him. I've known Nigel for 30 odd years. We moved from the West End into the cheap Clerkenwell, as it then was. We thought it was the end of the world, but we arrived in a kingdom called Moorlands, where there was Branson Coates, Jasper Morrison, Inflate were passing through there. It was an amazing kind of place to arrive. But I knew of Nigel before that. I knew of narrative architecture today. I think I'd trodden on the drawings, I'd brushed past them, I'd tried to work out what this was all about. And there was, of course, he talks about in his book, a kind of famous moment where a very eminent architect, after whom we name our most eminent award in this institute, decided that what that unit had done, all of whom have gone on to be teachers and thinkers and writers and designers, was what I term a famous fail, until Nigel's great supporter, ally, advisor on where he might live and how he might work, Alvin Boyowski stepped in, swung a different group of jurors in, and at a kind of very tense moment was saved. But that kind of set Nigel's reputation up as someone who was different and special. I've just checked with Nigel whether I can tell you the 2 jokes that were around at the time. He's agreed, so it's okay. The first one, which I'm pleased to say 40 years on actually from that event probably, he doesn't know, is that narrative architecture today, NATO with the slice through the O, well, what I was told it stood for was not another trendy object, which was slightly bitter from those who made that joke, but obviously amusing, but it was also untrue. And as you know, you'll see tonight, I mean, it's not untrue that he made beautiful things. And in fact, I remember my sister was a fashion designer. We were designing a small shop for her with no money. And there was a very, very beautiful cast aluminium mannequin that I could see across our 4-metre courtyard. And I went round to Nigel, if there's no taxman there, I think we paid £600 cash for this very, very beautiful thing, which he still has. And the point about, you know, Nigel and his team and those he collaborated with and the team at Branson Coates, and he pays great tribute to all the people who've passed through his life, was that it wasn't about trendiness. It was about immediacy. It was about coming from the Malverns, coming to London, finding out who he was, coming via Nottingham, having this kind of route into architecture and design that meant he thought about the world differently. I mean, he's as knowledgeable about Renaissance gardens and performance art as anyone I would know. I don't know many people who are knowledgeable about that, but he's supremely knowledgeable about many things, and I think he's always defined trends, and what he does is always challenging, but uncomfortable in some levels, but actually comfortable to engage with, and often very beautiful, and that's not a term we often use, but I think that's a really important term. The other term for NATO, which he was and is familiar with, is Nigel and the others. However, as the Lives in Architecture shows, and as my experience of knowing Nigel over a long period of time, is it's never been about Nigel and the others. It's been about the people he has met in his life, taught, worked with. In fact, even when he taught, he engaged with the students in their projects. He became one of them. He's personable, he's approachable, he's generous, he's thoughtful, he's not afraid to challenge people, but not for the fun of it. He's an architect to his boots, and I mean that not to say he's not a fantastic designer of products or furniture, but I think, and I would say this, a lot of great furniture, maybe uncomfortable, has been designed by architects. Nigel has designed comfortable as well as challenging, as well as beautiful objects, as well as fascinating buildings in Japan, in my home city, Monkey, home city of Sheffield, buildings that have been repurposed, reused, that kind of reflect an idea that now is rather drearily called retrofit. But in fact, Nigel's been about kind of engaging with the city and making places for life to happen, but not black box places, making places full of personality and character and performance, and encouraging performance. So I commend him to you, I commend him to us as the Institute, and I'd now like to invite him to the stage. Nigel.
Hello, everyone. It's great to be here on this, shall I call it a stage? I think the last time I was invited to lecture here was in 1986. And I'd done something apparently rather special, which was to open a cafe in Tokyo. And that merited being invited here. In fact, I just got off the plane. I'd been 2 days back here, not even, and was kind of on this stage describing what I'd done in Japan. Because Japan was the place at the time. Everybody wanted to know about it, and everybody wanted to kind of engage with this extraordinary culture on the other side of the world. And I'm sort of beginning at the beginning, and I'm going to spare you the baby pictures, but I quite like this picture, and it's hard to reconcile the fact that it's me. And yet, what kind of aspirations are there in those eyes and that head? I was obviously into clothes because there's a scarf. I think we must all have been wearing Indian scarves at the time. But at 19, I went to Nottingham University to study architecture. And you could do anything you wanted on the course in architecture as long as it had a flat roof and was made of brick. So it was really challenging, and but not challenging enough. And so after a while, I did come to London. I worked in Lambeth Environmental Design Department, which did housing in South London. And not long after I'd graduated from the AA, I met my first real boyfriend, Antonio Lagarto, who was studying sculpture at St. Martin's. And we started to do conceptual work with photography. And perhaps it was a way of saving on materials, but there's nothing like using your own body in your artwork. And I guess it was part of the mood of the time to declare yourself to be part of what your proposal was. But that wasn't normal in architecture, because in architecture, and this is a sort of a gripe I still have with Bernard always objectified, Bernard Tschumi that is, he always objectifies his work and puts it into an architectural place. And I respect that, but it was perhaps because of his approach that I wanted to do the opposite. I wanted to celebrate my part as both author and participant in the work. And I guess this piece, which was originally 2 photographs on opposite sides of a gallery space in Portugal, shows us both on the beach. And I still find this an enigmatic work, because we are obviously being photographed from 2 sides. Our photographer friend stood in the sea to take one picture, and on the beach to take the other. But if you see them across a room, they make a kind of unity, because Antonio is the top figure and I'm the bottom figure. And it's this sort of set of relationships of figures in space, which I thought sort of indicated a more fundamental nature in architecture than necessarily walls and doors and windows. And that kind of work, well, it represents a time, a period in which I must confess being incredibly influenced by contemporary art, by performance art, by Bruce MacLean, by Gordon Matter Clark, by a whole range of people. Art somehow seemed to, for me, to carry more intellectual and emotional density than the sort of postmodernism that was being thought of as the great avant-garde at the time. And I mentioned my first partner, and how productive that was in terms of our work. But sometime after we'd met, I was invited to make a show in a small gallery in Florence, and I'd been going to Florence for some time and absolutely felt like I was a new person there, and still do. And this particular project, which is called The Night Lives of the Artists, proposes a special space which was based on the gallery itself, being transposed to the middle of the Piazzale degli Uffizi, in the space that Vasari himself, the writer of The Lives of the Artist, because it was also part of the gay cruising circuit around Florence. And that was one of the things I loved about Italy. You could meet incredible people and have great events were extraordinary and transgressive and beautiful. But there was also this undercurrent of culture that was sort of seeped through into everything. And I was bringing the two together in this work. And skip to a few years later to the early 80s, when I was teaching in Bennington College in Vermont, and spending half the week in New York City, going to the kitchen, going to various galleries, soaking that up. And one particular movie by Nam June Paik was particularly interesting to me. It was of a skier, and the view of the skier would have as she descended the mountain, with the kind of rushing effect of the trees and just almost the speed and the feel of skiing was expressed in this video. And I thought, that captures what I would like architecture to feel like and to translate. Plus, the trans avant-garde was at full tilt in New York. It, the lashings of paint, the immediacy of being able to kind of do painting battle with your canvas, that had to be translatable into architecture. So this project, the ski station, sort of experiments with the role of the figure and the architecture, and how the architecture can reflect the movement and speed. So there is a sort of convention in these drawings. These are sort of an axonometric, and these are sort of a plan, but plans don't usually have big figures drawn on top of them like that. So this was kind of a turning point. And it also encouraged a whole lot of other drawings that were part of the project, because once you were kind of on a roll, then being able to imagine something and put myself into the work is really all part of the possibilities, including what it might be like, after a hard day's skiing, have a nice bed with a crown on top. Why not? Meanwhile, apart from the AA teaching and sort of experimenting with architecture, Antonio and I basically deconstructed our flat in South Kensington, which was in an area that was referred to as the scruffy bit by Peter York. Peter York, who I'm sure you all know, who invented Sloane Rangers and all of that, could see our flat from the street. And he asked around if anyone knew who this flat belonged to. And he came around and he produced this story, Pasolini Meets Palladio, which appeared in Harper's and Queen, which was, of course, a fashion magazine, but one with a very witty use of language. And it was important in the magazine that part of it was dedicated to things other than fashion. And this article had such reach. Everybody we knew in London knew about our flat, wanted to come and see it. What was so special about it? It had a half-scraped doorway. But that door, in a sense, was the beginning of my building career. Not my history at the Architectural Association or all my efforts in that. It was this kind of photograph that appeared in the World of Interiors and, strangely, in Brutus magazine in Japan. And it was because of that my career kind of took off. Except there was one project that I'd been asked to do by a friend who I knew from the world of nightclubs. That was Jasper Conran. And he had bought a house. I think his mother bought it for him, really, but it was in just outside Regent's Park, in Regent's Park Terrace. And armed with this new flowing drawing style, I started to translate what he told me he wanted. And you can see that there's a similarity with the drawing of the ski station. But the path, the stairway, is represented as a kind of continuous line, and there are arrows appearing in the drawing. But, of course, it's a conventional house, conventional entrance with a kitchen and dining room and a sitting room, and he wanted a beautiful library with kind of fine metal details. And I suggested a gym, which never really happened, and then a studio on the top floor. So this drawing turned out to be incredibly useful when dealing with a client, because it wasn't a plan or a section. So I had a client, and I had a busy life, as much at night as in the day. And it's very hard to get it across in this evening in the limited time we have, but London was living the most extraordinary period of creativity where, fashion magazines turned sort of into lifestyle magazines. The Face captured that early spirit in the 80s. I was photographed for the Face. I think possibly the only architect who was in the magazine, at least up until that stage. And it caught the zeitgeist. Like the top picture, you know, whatever happened to the zoot suit? Hard times. Hard times were kind of an aesthetic that had been acquired from punk, but then somehow translated and evolved through the new romantic night world stuff. And it occurred to me that the behavior of people in nightclubs was a phenomenon that merited a bit of thought. And this is actually the first article in Alvin Boyarsky's new AA Files magazine. It's the first article of the first issue. And maybe Alvin didn't realize, but Antonio, my boyfriend, was the creative director. And so I think he got into the pole position for that reason. And so there is, as Simon has said, there was an extraordinary gathering of energy in sort of the 81, 82, when the backbone of architectural projects was able to gather in, to draw in all sorts of other influences. And I'd say to my students, look, I don't really want you to read French philosophy. I'd much prefer you to translate the things, the music you like listening to at night, and to, you know, pick up a fanzine and see if that's got anything to do with architecture. And I believe that it did have. And so at the end of 1983 academic year, when the projects had all been based on the Bermondsey area south of the Thames, the work looked like this. And you could walk on it. You could sort of bump into it. It would make a noise because that's a table made out of an old car bonnet. The drawings were as much about the rituals and sequences that are proposed in the projects. They're not just about the materiality of the buildings. They're about events crossing with landscapes that could reveal all sorts of social archaeology, and that could be somehow blended into a kind of bricolage of what was there before and what might be there in the future. So although it was sort of a bit towards the future, it didn't play the kind of the continuous game that architects always play, which is to reimagine the future, let's say buildings that are not there, but somehow leaving behind what's been there before, obliterating the memory. This work incorporated memory, the next future, the immediate future, the present, and had a sort of resonance that didn't go down very well with James Stirling. So, what was to be done? The building design had it blazoned all over the front page. AA students in design row, I think it said. And Alvin wanted us to explain to the world what this work was all about. And he proposed a book, but we thought a magazine would be better, and indeed was much more appropriate for the time. And I mean, I can't show it all to you, but my own piece in NATO issue #1 is called Ghetto and Globe. And I guess what I was interested in this title and in the phenomenon of the city and how we were working with it, is that little incidents like the clip from a Heaven 17 video at the top, or Vivienne Westwood's Pirate Clothes, or Malcolm McLaren's Duck Rock album cover, these kind of express the spirit, or kind of connected to what we were imagining in this sort of noisy, filmic, slightly deliberately chaotic interpretation of the city, which to us seemed much more real, much more connected to what London was really about, given the fact that docklands had been pretty much flattened and warehouses were empty, and all of that stuff of the conversion of banks into pizzerias and all of that hadn't really started. I think it's fair to say that we were ahead of the game. And some of the statements in it, I mean, I prefer you to read these things that are on screen rather than me kind of rather than me speaking them out. But we were channeling the Situationists, I think. The Situationists were sort of ringing in our ears. And there was a real sense that you could take stuff that you could find on the street, or you could get from a scrapyard, or you could think about a building that was a kind of conspicuous ruin, and actually imagine something that was more vital and more connected to future possibilities than if you were to design a building from scratch. I'm showing you here an exhibition called Arc Albion. And I was at the AA bookshop yesterday, and the people who run it pulled out 3 catalogues for this exhibition, and they said, we've got these 3, there's just 3 left. Would you sign them, please? We're going to charge £100 for them. So, you know, if you haven't bought the book, you might like to buy the, oh, there's much more in the book. But this exhibition, for me, was a real eye-opener. And it started to apply this kind of atmosphere that I've just been describing. On the one hand, touching reality. And so when you arrived, you saw these photographs of this guy who was, you know, like a fotoromanzo. He's telling the visitor what is about to happen to this part of South London, which is around County Hall, Waterloo Station, St Thomas's Hospital was my chosen area. And the exhibition proposed a kind of exhibition of architecture, a living exhibition of architecture, a bit like the ones that had been in the Festival of Britain a long time before. But it's 1984, okay? All of people like me, gay people, were all terrified we were going to die. AIDS was rampant, and people were dying like flies. And it's only recently, and perhaps because of the contemplation associated with the book, that I've started to think about whether, you know, the AIDS thing has affected some of the imagery. And I do believe it has, because in the sense that this sense of fragility, of the possibility of everything collapsing, of life being extra precious, I really do believe that affected this project. And there's, of course, it's an aesthetic. It's, what was it? Not another trendy object. Well, maybe these were, I mean, we weren't looking over our shoulders, though, so they couldn't have been trendy because we were doing them, no one else was doing this. So that's sort of belies the trend thing. But I love the trend of rubbish chutes that were coming out of lots of buildings which were being transformed at the time. So I took the rubbish chute and thought, oh, that's a kind of really good motif to indicate the idea of the building as a kind of living building site. Or some giant things like the fishtails, I can't remember what they were now, or Albion, the Roman giant Albion sort of proliferated and became a gang of Albions over there. But, you know, this model was the first of many. I've done lots of these where, you know, make up the feeling of a city with a deliberate attempt to be slightly off-key, you know, a bit like the sort of deliberately badly painted, like the trans avant-garde's efforts at painting, which you know, were often teetering between, you know, they couldn't actually present themselves as good painters. They had to be, it had to have rawness attached to it, and this perhaps was part of my story. And I think this drawing, there are 6 drawings in this sequence which were the ones that most fervently captured the spirit of this project. So I've just been telling you about AIDS and the sense of the body being invaded, but perhaps buildings could be thought of in the same way, where we're cutting through existing buildings, changing the speed at which you would experience a building was kind of an exciting proposition, not to destroy them, but to perform a kind of alchemy or anatomy on those buildings and think of the people and the events in it as though the activity of the street and the buildings had merged together into one kind of spiraling conundrum of what architecture is. As was mentioned, we did objects too, and this is Mark Prizeman's insect stool, which was so unstable you couldn't sit on it. But it got lovely details, sort of like it's got a sort of egg sac underneath the Vespa seat. So, and it's the Vespa seat's painted in gold, in sort of purple metallic paint. The sort of thing that you painted onto metal surfaces that has got a sort of deliberately industrial bubbling effect. Or this is actually my bedroom in South Kensington, and Katrina Beaver's very feminist chandelier made of sanitary towels and coat hangers, which was very much ahead of its time, and my wardrobe made from security bars that were sort of being thrown out of Chantal Cody's chocolate shop on King's Road, translated into the Wombat wardrobe, in which the clothes were sort of bagged up. But it had, all that furniture had a sort of, it all looked as though it was going to sort of collapse, or that it had just come together, that it had a sort of organic vitality about it. And you could say the same about some other people's fashion. I think I mentioned Vivienne Westwood, and I think she did truly sort of, she moved it wasn't just clothing, it was manifesto clothing, that fashion designers were activists, and I think we were being activists too at this time. And the possibilities that fashion could incorporate other cultures, just as we were doing in architecture, and we also could incorporate the let's say, people wearing clothes into our magazines. And I'm struck by Catherine Hamnett's kind of, she went to Lawrence Corner all the time. She'd buy up all this stuff, take it apart, copy the patterns, make up the clothes and bung them in the washing machines in laundrettes, which is why they're so soft and beautiful. And no one had done that before. So someone was doing that to clothes, the same sort of thing that we were trying to do to buildings. And all of this traveled, as I mentioned, incredibly well, because in Tokyo, they couldn't get enough of what was happening in London. There was feature after feature after feature in Brutus magazine and others of what was going on in London. There were fashion shows being conducted in Tokyo with, people from the WAG Club flown out. 20 guys from the WAG Club were sort of rounded up and taken off to Tokyo to be in Takeo Kikuchi's menswear show. I mean, that's kind of a sign of the times that is completely different to now, but it hadn't happened before. And as is recounted in the book, this very well-dressed gentleman called Sai Chen read Brutus, turned up in London, and was reeling off the possibilities of what might be done in Tokyo. And I thought, oh yeah, right. And tore his card up because he just kind of lost touch. But then he got back in touch and asked me, because of this picture, or something like it, he wanted a restaurant, which eventually became known as the Metropole Restaurant. And it was the coolest place in Tokyo. And not only were all the kind of fashion crowd of Tokyo crowd out in force, but people passing through, creative folk part. There was Paul Smith, there was Michael Nyman, there were people, there were the guy who started ID magazine. The traffic between London and Tokyo was extraordinary. There's something to be said that I have to mention about the Metropole restaurant that was in an old garage, built in a garage. I wanted a space with high ceilings. And it became evident that my clients wanted something that had a kind of European patina. They didn't want smart, perfect design. They wanted a sort of sense of the traces of the past. That's why they liked Europe at this time, and London, more than America, because everything's a bit shabby. So I had to sort of build in a sense of the layered, the subtle transformation that a space that's been there for a long time might have had. And it's very difficult to do if you're just doing it in an old garage with no architectural detail at all. So I said to them, why don't you give us a 50 grand budget to invite some artists and to buy some artworks and to get a sense of diversity into the space, so that it's not just me and the design team marking this space. So this is an Edward Allington kind of drawing painting at the back. The backdrop, this drape was painted by a friend, Zaza Wentworth-Stanley, who was set designer. And the curtains they were rescued from Stratford Theatre in East London. So we spent very wisely, and they got something incredibly good. And it was all done remarkably quickly on Tokyo timescale. And that kind of thing seemed so different from the other work that I was engaged in. This is another occasion in which this building was important for us, and NATO was invited to do a project for a star of our choice, a home for the person that we chose, and it was exhibited upstairs in the Florence Hall. And I think this was an effort on behalf of the RIBA to try to bring in people from other worlds, and it seemed that we were ideally placed amongst architects to draw in, because we'd been in every magazine going all around the world. And they weren't necessarily architecture magazines, they were style magazines, they were interiors magazines, they were, it was popular culture. So this is a proposal for a house, the ideal house for Derek Jarman, who said he'd like a place in a favourite spot in Dorset above Dancing Ledge, which is also the name of his first book. And I won't go into detail right now, but I think it's a beautiful project that exemplifies the reuse of an existing location, an existing place, and fuses that with the sensibility, and his complex sensibility, in part punk and in part historicist, coming together in this project. And that sort of sensibility infuses also possibly the most iconic of all of our projects, the Café Bongo, which was a new version of the cafe in one of the Parco department stores in Shibuya in Tokyo. That great big concrete hulk of a building that you can see above the wing. And although, Charles Jenks incorrectly said this is a piece of architecture with a plane crashing into the building. Well, it's not crashing into the building, it's actually emerging from the building, because the engines are pointing outwards at us. They are dynamic enough to suggest that there's motion in that direction. But I've also realized that the iconic nature of this is about the composition, because at the time people didn't really celebrate the composition or think that they thought it was just a mess, a deliberate mess. But I think you will understand what I mean when I say I don't think this is all that casual, that it's, there is that column's holding up that mass of concrete above. So it's a little odd, but we put extra, overdid the Corinthian at the top, which sort of saved it. And this project was based on La Dolce Vita. And for the beginning of the project, I already got into this idea of bringing together a whole load of artists and designers and other people who are not architects, all part of our team. So at the beginning of the project, we hired a BFI preview cinema to watch La Dolce Vita and celebrated Anita Ekberg's descent from the silvery plain, and the incredible scenes in that film, and the way that during the pace of the film that we get introduced to this incredibly glamorous lifestyle with the first paparazzi and kind of the Swedish glamour of Anita Ekberg, with the Italian sort of cool of Mastroianni, and the backdrop of the baths of Caracalla, of crumbling walls and great overscaled architecture. Anyway, it materialized in Japan, and this was one of the most successful and visited points in the whole of Tokyo over the 7 years that it existed, which is quite a long time for Japan. But we had NATO still to do. So NATO number 2 put together various projects that we'd done separately or together. And then NATO number 3, which incidentally features the face of my friend Jerry De Bastiano. So over the years I've just been describing, Jerry started off as a boy, and in this he became a girl. So he's my cover girl for NATO number 3, but he's fused with the city. And that sort of fusion, that kind of bringing together, that bridging, I think you all have understood is part of, what the reason that I wrote this book, was to kind of make sense of all this difference. Ivona Blaswick, who had seen the Arc Albion exhibition and was inspired by it, and inspired by all the people in NATO and the energy of the group, I think, invited us to take over the Air Gallery, which was on Rosebery Avenue, a 2-story non-profit gallery with, in which an edgy show like NATO seemed to be the perfect inhabitant. We thought that the ground floor, since it was about the city as a whole, we called it Gamma City, sort of nuclear energy, but sort of harnessed for creativity, could be best represented as the marketplace. And then upstairs, we'd have the boudoir. So we kind of provocatively divided everything into these, that there is in a city, into these 2 holdalls, the marketplace and the boudoir. And when I look at this now, it's sort of, there's that stool that you saw before, but there's also this. Now this could be featured in Dezeen from yesterday. It's kind of, the aesthetic is way ahead of its time. I don't remember who did that. Mark, do you remember? Katrina, probably. But plastic curtains, very raw materials, very kind of make-do, deliberately make-do. And that, this is tidied up a bit because it's a shop that's, we spend a lot of other people's money on this shop. This is Catherine Hamnett's shop on Sloane Street, which opened in 1988. And she said, I'm sick of the Norman Foster shop and Peter Bertelsen, the financier of the shop that was in Brompton Cross. I want a shop with tons of stuff in it. I want a lip sofa, and I want a Venetian mirror, and I want fish tanks. I say, yes, 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 Catherine, you can have all of those things. But of course, you couldn't just throw all this stuff together. So once again, I want to draw your attention to the composition. This curved sort of balcony-like structure, half into the room, which is full of holes, a bit digital looking before its time again. But the counter, not a barrier to the shopper, but a coercive kind of guide to the shopper. Because apparently, and I think I knew this instinctively, shoppers go into a space and they start on the right-hand side and they go anti-clockwise around the shop. They go along the clothes rails like this, kind of something I'd like to try on. So that kind of motion is captured in this, and then you come and sit down, or your boyfriend is sitting there, or your girlfriend, or whatever, underneath this rather sort of freely interpreted Venetian mirror. And I'm zigzagging all over the place, but that's kind of the point of the talk, because I'd had my first furniture license in Japan. When we did the Metropole restaurant, they said, what furniture are we going to put in the restaurant? And I said, we can do something like this. And they said, okay, we'll make it. And then I had my first furniture license with virtually, apart from Jasper's house, virtually my first job. And with a bit of money I had from Japan, I bought a ruined house in Italy, which was sort of fulfilling a dream. And as has been noted, the ruined state of that house really was a kind of invitation to play. So a different version of play with some of my contributors in Japan, Mark Prizeman, Tom Dixon, Zaza, Carlos Villanueva Brandt, and myself, and Annabelle Gray, textile designer. And second project in Japan, rather the first big building in Tokyo, the wall, in which I asked Grayson Perry if he'd do a sculpture for the column in the center of the archway. Exhibitions continuing in London with the ICA Metropolis exhibition, the Ecstacity exhibition at the AA, and these quotes from the book, just throwing in the fact that somehow these examples of work are reflected on, I hope, incisively, with the main picture from the Ecstacity exhibition, which sort of, again, taking an urban setting and concentrating on a monumental part of London to see how existing buildings might be prized open and layered with new structures. I appeared in a book which had all those cool people from New York, Tokyo, London, etc., by the makeup artist Francois Nard, who photographed each of something like 120 people, and that's what makes up the book. So I'd crept into this world unexpectedly, and was the only architect again. We did an exhibition in Firminy in the southeast of France, in which artists and myself and Stuart Helm were invited to reimagine one of the apartments in Corb's Unité d'Habitation. I thought we have to make a reference to the modular man, but since we'd imagined a gay couple who were super aware of AIDS living in this apartment. We painted kind of blood cells on the walls. The modular man had to have a dick. We experimented with, we were doing lots of shops, including Jigsaw, which was our first chain, followed not long after for Liberties. But I'd worked a lot with the body and using the body as a participant and a player in my work. But think about this stair. The stair is there almost to anticipate that body, as though the stair is performing a kind of embrace. And gradually we got to build, to be invited for various competitions, like the Jeffrey Museum, as it was then known, New Wing, which we won with this horseshoe shaped sort of vernacular, built with vernacular language, but kind of introducing the visitor to a few of the surprises. And perhaps most surprising of all as this project in Sheffield, which, if you see Rowan Moore's article in The Observer, is filthy dirty now, and the cowlings on top are all pointing in different directions, but I kind of like it both clean and dirty. That led to the Powerhouse UK exhibition in Whitehall, which was commissioned by Tony Blair's government in 1997 and opened in the spring of 1994, and I think was a brave attempt to sort of to harness the creative industries to put a foot forward for Britain. And the famous Body Zone, work with Italian design house Fornasetti, the book Ecstacity, which was published in 2003, the participation in the 2006 Venice Biennale with my department, Royal College of Art, contributing to a discourse on the city, which then led to my Ecstacity project in Tate Modern, and a year later to the Hypnerotosphere installation at Aaron Betsky's Biennale. And I'm going to skip this. I'm showing you this because this is part of the installation of our space at the Venice Biennale in the Arsenale, which was exploring once again the body as a medium of expression of architecture, of construction. When I showed this at a lecture in Florence, it outraged the teachers. They, what the hell has this got to do with architecture? I'd just like to show you quickly my sketchbooks, and that kind of answers it really, because there are lots of drawings of figures in my sketchbooks that switches between spaces and buildings and architecture incessantly. A project for reimagining Vauxhall, not as the hideous bunch of turkey-shaped buildings that it is at the moment, but perhaps a revival of the pleasure gardens, but cast in a present view. This is a project, an installation at the Triennale Museum of Design, which is part of the Karma Sesso e Design exhibition, in which I wanted to use my furniture, some of which had been in the Venice Biennale, other pieces being made for kind of limited editions. But I decided to make a reference to Francis Bacon triptych and explore how the furniture could be like the bodies and sort of dribble into the room. But in some ways, this wasn't explicit enough. So we had a kind of a very primitive version of augmented reality. There was a table with 3 iPads. And if you lift the iPad like this and point it at one of the frames, a film would begin. And this is one of those films. So it sort of fulfilled the voyeuristic desire to see something that others couldn't. So whilst the installation, there was no figure there, the film gave the impression that you were seeing, you know, what the butler saw. And one person was holding the iPad like this and looking at the figures and looked around just to check that there wasn't anybody really there. Anyway, I continue to design things, mostly things rather than spaces. But I just want to end by saying that I think that I've realized, thanks to this monumental task of writing a book during lockdown, that although I've done so many different things and such diverse contexts, there are threads going through all of these. There's the thread of kind of pulling spaces from the past, of overlaying them with the new, of kind of contrasting scale, or trying to convey a manifesto-like quality in a chair. And I just presented this outdoor chair and footrest at the Salon del Mobile just a couple of weeks ago. And when I was explaining it to people, I said, well, the frame is like a drawing, and the cushions are floating inside the drawing. And it really does give that impression that it is, that the cushions are floating. And anyway, so thanks to my queer subversive drive, I never quite fitted the strict format of the British establishment, but I never wore my difference on my sleeve. It constituted a vantage point like any other. Like Zaha, I believed in the civitas of architectural culture. I worked as an atelier and stuck to my guns.